There was a speech last week by John Kerry at Kew Gardens where he warned that there were 100 days left to save the next 100 years. But there was no government minister present. Well, does that show that the government doesn't really care about this?
No, I don't think that shows it. The government has actually put forward proposals which are certainly leading in the world, more extensive than the United States and anywhere else. The problem is delivery. Governments always find delivery more difficult. This government has got a very good programme. It's accepted the sixth carbon budget, which was the Climate Change Committee's budget. It has set itself targets for 2030 and 2035, which are world-leading, but it hasn't delivered yet. It hasn't produced the legislation necessary, the regulations necessary, or the local leadership through helping local government to do what it should do. And that is what we are pressing it hard for now.
And why hasn't it delivered yet? Is it COVID, or are there bigger structural issues that are going on?
Well, I'm not
here?
prepared to blame COVID. The fact is that there have been lots of people working on it, and some things it has delivered. I mean, saying by 2030 all cars sold in Britain will have to be electric or equivalent was a major step forward and has changed the motor car industry not only here but worldwide. And there's other steps which need to be taken like that. But the problem is that it takes them a very long time to work out. By the time all those people have come in and said, well, this is not quite right and we'd like that and the other, they don't seem to recognise that it's better to not to allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good, but get on with it. We need, for example, totally to overhaul our electricity system over the next 15 years, and you've got to start there. And so far, there appears to be no scheme to do that, just bits on the edges. That's just one example of many.
Well, we've really struggled with our nuclear power capacity, haven't we, in recent years? Do you think things are going to improve on that front, or are you basing more of your hopes on a focus on renewables?
Well, my view is that we have to have both. Nuclear power is, of course, a transition system. You need to have the protection of base load, and we haven't got an effective answer except nuclear at the moment. I hope we will. There's all the indications that we will have that, but the time taken and also the way the decisions are made is difficult to understand. I mean, if you want to level up, you would have thought that the next nuclear power station might be, say, in Wilfer or in the northwest, both places who want it, rather than, and I declare an interest because I live 40 miles away from it, so I'm not objecting to that, but there is Sizewell, which is, after all, in a part of the country where there is full employment, and perhaps one might have used the nuclear programme to kill two birds with one stone.
In terms of retrofitting people's homes, banning gas boilers and so on, do you think the public are ready for the measures that are necessary in order to drive our emissions down to reach net zero?
Well, no, they're not, and the reason is that the government hasn't taken forward what is a necessary part of this, which is twofold. One is a public information campaign, particularly to counter the arguments which the ex-deniers, I mean, the people don't deny climate change now. They can't because it's so obvious and manifest. So what they do now is to drag their feet and say it's going to be too expensive and the rest of it, which is, of course, not true, and the figures are very clearly that. But the government has got to show the public how it is going to help people make these decisions. It's also got to bring home to the house builders what a scandal it is that the house builders have been building houses which they know are not fit for the future. And the bill for retrofitting those million houses that have been recently built will in fact be placed on the shoulders of the people who bought the houses instead of out of the profits of the house builders, which is where it should have come. So the government's got a big programme that it needs to do to explain what it is going to do to make it possible for ordinary people to make these changes. It's perfectly possible to do it, but the government has got to show how. And so far, Its only success has been through local government, and that's another area where it ought to improve still more, because local government is its natural partner.
Well, Steve Baker and other Conservative MPs are starting to build a rebellion against some of these green measures that are necessary to reach net zero. What's your message to them?
Well, my message to them is that it won't be long before they will be blamed for the fact that the world is threatened by disaster, and that they really ought, if they are Conservatives or of any political party, just to look at the facts. And dragging your feet now is something that your children and grandchildren, indeed people alive today, will never forgive you for. Just look across the channel to Germany and just see what happened when they had those floods. The people blamed the government for not taking the actions which they should take. And many of the people who did the blaming were precisely the people who had dragged their feet and said that the government shouldn't actually spend the money or do the job. It's a very ungrateful world, I say to these few people who want to hold things up. But the ingratitude will come to you directly. So let's get behind this. It's going to cost us less than 1% of the GNP a year, and that's if you don't count any of the advantages. We can do it. It's the way to get out of COVID. It's the natural way forward. And anybody who doesn't think that, I'm afraid, is betraying the future, because the cost rises every year and the damage by delay increases every year.
Let's talk a bit more about COP. What's the point of this conference? Isn't it just a chance for people to have a bit of a jolly in lovely Glasgow?
Well, I'm not sure I put it that way in any way, but the fact of the matter is, it's a crucial conference, because what we've got to do is to ratchet up the agreements which have been entered into since the Paris Agreement 5 years ago. Paris Agreement was an absolutely earth-changing occasion, because it's the first time in the history of mankind that every nation on earth has signed up to fight climate change and to keep the increase in temperature down below 2 degrees and as near to 1.5 as is possible. Now, that's remarkable base. People have promised what they will do towards it. If you add the promises up, they are not enough. So what we have to do to start with is to get those promises so that they are enough, ratchet them up, and that's in the agreement, and this is the year we do it. The second thing we have to do is to bring forward the date, because the truth is now that most industrialized nations have signed up to getting to net zero by 2050, led by Britain. It's a great contribution that Britain has made. But what we need now is every nation, including the Chinese, who've signed up to net zero, but not until 2060, which is too late. And the third thing we have to do is to turn those promises into reality, both in the sense that nations start to deliver what they promise, and on the other hand also that the rich nations help the poor nations to jump from the conditions in which they are now to the sort of standards of living that they hope for, expect, and deserve, without the dirty in-between which destroys the planet. And we are committed to pay for that because we've caused the problem in the first place, and also we've benefited from it. So that is what we have to do, and they have to see the colour of our money. And that is a very difficult thing for this government at the moment because of its immoral decision to reduce its overseas aid budget. But it did certainly protect its climate change budget, but it did cut against all its promises, against the Conservative Party manifesto. It cut the overseas aid budget at a time in which these countries are in a much, much worse position than we are. So it's going to have to recover the confidence of the world that it really means what it says.
What about the big emitters? There's a warning today that 4 of the G20 nations, China, Russia, Brazil, and Australia, would have got climate targets that would lead to disastrous global warming. What can Britain do? What can other attendees at the COP summit actually do to change the positions of these countries?
Well, they're all in different circumstances, aren't there? I mean, first of all, China is actually doing a great deal. The issue there is that it's not doing enough, but it is doing a great deal, and we need to encourage it to move faster down that route because it believes in climate change, it recognizes it has to do it, and it therefore needs encouragement, and we need to use the tougher forms of encouragement that we have to help it. Australia, on the other hand, is absolutely a disgrace because it has a government which constantly refuses to face the facts that Australia is, by its exports as well as by its internal policies, a major emitter, and it should wake up and realise that it can't spend the rest of the time leaning on the rest of the world. And I'm very sorry, but Mr. Morrison has really lacked any kind of leadership on this. We really do have to press it, and we have to think strongly about whether it is a proper thing to have trade agreements with countries which are not prepared to lay on their populations the same things that we are laying on ours. That's one of the reasons why I find the agricultural agreement with Australia unacceptable, because we're going to ask our farmers to play their proper part in fighting climate change, and then they're going to be subject to the competition of Australian meat, which will have been produced by farmers who are not meeting anything like the same standards. So there's a real issue there. And then Russia, of course, this is a much bigger international issue about the dictatorial nature of Russia. And in Brazil, we have increasing hope that international action, particularly by the European Union, which is using trade mechanisms.
Because we